The room was colder than it should have been. The marble walls of the congressional chamber held their silence like a cathedral too long abandoned, a temple where justice was both worshipped and betrayed. The audience rustled, pages of paper, hushed whispers, distant camera clicks, but fell still as the great wooden door creaked open. Chief Justice Franklin Reed entered not as a man, but as a monument. His robe, dark as midnight, flowed like a second skin. His steps were measured, perfectly symmetrical, as if time itself adjusted to accommodate his presence. There were no smiles. Not from him. Not from the rows of suited aides or the senior senators who shifted in their chairs like nervous schoolchildren. He did not acknowledge the room. He didn't need to. His arrival spoke for him, a silent declaration of power, decades layered into the folds of his robe, into the silver strands of hair neatly parted, into the gaze that had once rendered presidents motionless and journalists mute. This was not a man you interrupted. This was the judiciary itself, draped in human form. Across from him, tucked in the third row of the committee dais, sat Congresswoman Lila Morgan, a name hardly whispered outside legal circles, a former public defender with calluses on her voice and quiet fire behind her eyes. She wasn't the ranking member. She wasn't senior. She was new, almost invisible in the grand theater of constitutional rituals. But she watched. She didn't glance up when Reed entered. She didn't blink when others instinctively straightened their spines. She remained still, pen resting lightly against a notepad whose margins were already filled with questions, not of law, but of conscience. Her lips pressed into a line unreadable. But her silence wasn't submission, it was calibration. As Reed took his seat at the lone witness table, a dozen cameras zoomed in, the feed flickering across the nation. He adjusted his microphone with the dignity of a man accustomed to amplification. Before him was a nameplate that needed no introduction: Chief Justice Franklin Reed. Then came the protocol. The chairman's voice droned through formalities, like a judge reading a sentence both expected and meaningless. No one truly listened. The room held its breath, waiting not for the questions, but for the unspoken war beneath them. This wasn't about technicalities. It was about the soul of something greater than law, trust, now crumbling under the weight of revelations and rumors. Lila flipped a page. Her name was next. She could feel the glances. Curious, dismissive, even sympathetic. What could this junior congresswoman possibly ask that a chief justice hadn't already dismissed 1,000 times before? But she didn't rise like someone granted permission. She rose like someone who had a right to be heard. Her chair barely made a sound. And when her eyes finally met his, steady, quiet, unflinching, there was a pause in the air, imperceptible to cameras but sharp as broken glass to anyone truly watching. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration. It was the beginning of something neither of them would be able to stop. And somewhere, behind the curtain of institutional civility, something old and rusted began to creak open. There was a hush, not the silence of reverence, but the breathless stillness before lightning tears the sky. Congresswoman Lila Morgan leaned forward, hands folded with unnatural calm, her voice low and clear. "Chief Justice Reed," she began, and the way she said his title, flat, unadorned, stripped it of its usual armor. "You stated in your prior rulings that no one, not even a judge, is beyond accountability. Do you still believe that?" Franklin Reed's eyes flickered. It was subtle, a momentary contraction of thought behind the seasoned calm, but it was there. He adjusted his cufflink, the gold one, engraved with his initials. A gesture as rehearsed as a sermon. "I stand by every word I have ever written for the court," he said, his tone polished but not warm. "The Constitution is clear." But the words didn't land as they used to. They hovered, elegant and hollow. Lila didn't nod, didn't smile. She slid a document forward, a photocopy of an internal memo, lightly creased, the ink faded at the edges. Her fingers tapped it once, a quiet summons to truth. "This memo," she said, "details a series of undisclosed meetings you held with Mr. Alan Greaves, CEO of Navera Systems, while the Supreme Court was hearing United States versus Navarez. Are you familiar with the document? There it was. The first tremor. Reed's hand paused midair. He blinked once, slowly, like a man calculating the velocity of the blow. The chamber tensed, every eye and lens narrowing in. The committee chairman shifted in his seat, lips parting, but no interruption came. Because no one knew what to say. Because no one expected it to come from her. I do not comment on private meetings that pertain to national security consultations, Reed replied after a pause that felt too measured. And I certainly don't validate unofficial leaks. Lila didn't flinch. Mr. Greaves wasn't in the intelligence community. He was your personal acquaintance. And his company stood to gain billions in government contracts that were approved within days of your ruling. Silence thudded against the marble walls. Reed's mouth pressed into a firm line. Are you accusing the Chief Justice of the United States of corruption, Congresswoman? The word corruption echoed like a gunshot, raw and offensive, pulled into the air like a curtain. I'm asking, she said softly, whether the gavel still answers to the law or to those who dine with it behind closed doors. A senator coughed. A camera beeped softly. Reed leaned back, for the first time not in control of the moment, but absorbing it. The crack had formed. Thin, almost invisible, but real. The marble exterior, the doctrine, the black robe, the decades of reverence, had taken its first wound. A single, deliberate question from a woman half the Chief Justice's age had done what scandals, headlines, and think pieces could not. She had pierced the myth. And Franklin Reed, revered jurist of the nation, felt the chill of something new. Exposure. Not defeat.
Not yet.
But the kind of exposure that seeps in slowly, like water through stone. That hollows. That erodes. He gathered himself with care. I suggest, Congresswoman, that we remain within the bounds of this committee's scope, he said, voice sharpened. Lila met his gaze with one that neither sharpened nor softened. It simply held. As if to say, the public scope is wider than yours. And in that second, between the strike of pride and the stillness of reckoning, the drama of power tilted, if only slightly. Not enough to fall, but enough to signal the inevitable. The first crack was now visible to the nation. And marble, once cracked, never forgets where it broke. The morning after the hearing, the headlines bore his name like a wound. Reed's integrity questioned in Greaves' scandal. The gavel under fire. But it wasn't the newspapers that unsettled Franklin Reed. It was the shift in the air, subtle but suffocating, as if the pillars of the court were absorbing the public's breathless disbelief. He walked into the chamber that day not with the stride of a guardian of the Constitution, but like a man stepping into a place that no longer bent to his presence. The clerks still rose. The justices still nodded.
But the air had changed.
Reverence had thinned. Outside, the protests had begun, not chaotic or furious, but solemn. Nurses in scrubs, farmers in dusty boots, a teacher holding a cardboard sign that read, "We obey the laws you twist." They weren't shouting. They were watching. That was worse. Congresswoman Lila Morgan stood just across the street, speaking quietly to a woman in her 50s, widowed, exhausted, wearing the steel badge of a postal worker. Reed saw her from the window. Their conversation was brief, but the woman's eyes glistened when she touched Lila's hand. No cameras. No microphones. Just pain being witnessed. That same afternoon, Lila returned to the committee room, not with documents, but with people. She began her testimony not with a legal argument, but with a name. Terrence Alston, Vietnam veteran. Convicted for refusing to hand over his farmland to Navarez Systems, land that had been in his family since Reconstruction. He lost his appeal. The court cited national interest. Chief Justice Reed wrote the opinion. The gallery was silent. Maria Sanchez, hospital nurse. Her daughter was killed when faulty surveillance tech, sold by Navarez, malfunctioned during a federal raid in Houston. She sued. Her case was dismissed without trial. She continued. One name after another. Not cases. Not numbers.
People.
Human lives folded into footnotes under Reed's legacy of eloquent jurisprudence. "Mr. Reed," she said at last, turning her eyes to him, "your rulings cite doctrine. But justice is not theory. It is felt by flesh and blood." Franklin Reed stared ahead, unblinking, unmoving. But something within him stirred. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was shame. No man holds the law for 40 years without believing he is its servant. But now he was being shown the altar he'd helped build, and the sacrifices made upon it. The hearing room had never felt so human. A young man in a wheelchair was wheeled forward. He had no speech, only a recording device. It played his message in monotone, every word slow, deliberate. "Your ruling said my injury was a price of liberty. My spine is not an abstract." And then silence. Terrible, beautiful silence. Reed's throat tightened, not because he had no rebuttal, but because rebuttal would dishonor what could no longer be denied. His judgments had reached further than his conscience ever dared to look. He had built a fortress of doctrine. But doctrine does not bleed. People do. That night, alone in his study, Franklin pulled out one of his old draft opinions, one that never saw light. It was a dissent he never published, for a case he'd ultimately voted with a majority. His notes were furious, impassioned, full of doubt and fire. He had buried it, chosen the cleaner path. Now he read it like a stranger discovering a younger self, a man who once believed that truth meant fighting even when the robes around him stood still. For the first time in years, he felt something fracture, not in the world, but in himself. He looked at his reflection, the black robe hanging behind him like a shadow he could no longer wear without weight. Outside, the nurse with the sign was still there. She had come back. And across the city, someone had stenciled on a courthouse wall, "Law is nothing until it meets the people it claims to protect." And in that truth, something in Reed began to collapse and rebuild. Tryon Kai Part 4. Quoting the system against itself. Al drama. Gon tu bu cam, jiao cam suk, chi teet, viet lin tuc kong chia ra ton kak fan no, ko su lin ket jua kak fan, tiing on. Franklin Reed arrived early the next morning. No motorcade. No press. He walked up the courthouse steps as he had done thousands of times before, but something in his gait had changed. Not slower, not weaker, but heavier. Like each step carried the weight of every page he'd written and every silence he'd once mistaken for wisdom. Inside, a copy of the Constitution rested on the table in front of him, its pages dog-eared, bookmarked, underlined. Not for ceremony. For reckoning. The hearing chamber, now packed beyond capacity, felt different. Not theatrical, tribunal-like. The people had come not to witness the law defend itself, but to see whether it could still be humbled by truth. Journalists whispered. Students leaned forward. Former clerks sat in the back row, tense. Even the air conditioning seemed to hesitate. Congresswoman Lila Morgan entered last, not with triumph, but with an unwavering calm, like someone who had carried a truth too long to fear power. She didn't address Reed with disdain. No outrage. Just the stillness of someone unshaken. And then something no one expected. Justice Reed asked to speak. The committee chair hesitated, then nodded. The microphones crackled. "I have served the bench for 43 years, he began, voice low but precise. "I was taught that the law is the highest expression of reason, that to protect it, we must remove ourselves from emotion, that impartiality is sacred. But I now see that in stripping ourselves of humanity, we sometimes strip the law of justice." No one moved. Not even the stenographer blinked. He continued, pulling out copies of his own prior rulings, those once cited in classrooms and courts alike, and read them aloud. But this time, not with pride, with sorrow. As if each sentence was a monument to something lost. "In Alston versus Navarus, I wrote, when liberty conflicts with property, the Constitution protects the broader order. But Mr. Alston was liberty, his soil, his family, his dignity. And I failed him." He quoted himself, word for word, and then dismantled the reasoning, brick by brick, like a craftsman undoing his own cathedral because he discovered it was built on graves. Lila watched in silence. There was no need to interrupt. Franklin Reed was now indicting the very system he had once fortified. I wrote that economic necessity did not excuse dissent in cases of national security. Yet I never asked who defined necessity. I never asked whom it served. That was my cowardice dressed in doctrine. At one point, his voice cracked, not theatrically, not for effect, but because the realization had become too real. His lifetime of eloquent neutrality had cost others their very right to breathe freely. A staffer passed him a glass of water. He waved it off gently. His hand shook, but his eyes had never been more focused. "I am not here to defend myself," he said. "I am here to confess what the law refuses to admit, that even the purest logic, when detached from the pain of the people, becomes cruelty by another name." Then came the moment that cracked the chamber open. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a letter, yellowed, sealed in wax, unopened. It had been sent to him decades ago by a mother whose son had died after a ruling he had authored denying prisoner protections. "I could never bring myself to read it," he whispered. "Today, I do." He opened it. "Read it aloud." The room did not breathe. "You never saw my son," the mother had written. "But I hope, one day, you will see a reflection in him." By the time he finished, there were no gasps. Just stillness. The kind that only comes when truth no longer needs a microphone. Franklin Reed looked around, at the lawmakers, at the staffers, at the citizens whose lives he had once considered hypotheticals. "You asked me why I ruled as I did. I now ask myself how I lived with it. The answer is I didn't. I merely survived it." And then, turning toward Lila Morgan, "You did not accuse me.
You reminded me
Of what justice is meant to be, not perfect but human." As he stepped down, the silence followed. Not as judgment. As absolution earned, not given. And for the first time in decades, Franklin Reed walked out of a courtroom not as a justice, but as a man finally judged by the very law he once controlled. Outside, no cameras flashed. No anthem played. But someone placed a hand on his shoulder, a young protester. No words, just a nod. It was enough. Because sometimes quoting the system against itself is not betrayal. It is how you begin to save it. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves with fanfare. They don't break through with fireworks or roaring crowds. They arrive quietly, like a breath being held too long, released at last, not with noise, but with gravity. And in that courthouse, after Justice Franklin Reed stepped down, the room shifted. It wasn't a verdict. No one banged a gavel. No official declared the hearing adjourned. But everyone knew something had ended. Or perhaps something had finally begun. The chair of the committee leaned forward, his hands now unclenched, his voice softened by what he'd just witnessed. "Let the record reflect," he murmured, though no one would ever forget, "that the witness has concluded his testimony." But no transcript could capture what had truly unfolded. Across the room, even the most hardened skeptics, those who had come ready to dismiss the hearing as a performance or a political stunt, sat motionless. Lila Morgan looked down at her notes, but didn't need them anymore. She wasn't gloating. There was no "I told you so" in her silence. Only a deep, complicated grief for how long it had taken to get here. Reporters who had come armed with pre-written headlines now stared at blank screens. Their fingers hovered, as if unsure how to report on a man unmaking himself so the law could be rebuilt in the ruins of his honesty. And then the old woman in the third row stood. No one knew her name. No one had noticed her before. She wore a plain blue scarf and clutched a photograph in her hand, creases so deep the image had nearly faded. She didn't say a word, just stepped forward slowly, holding the photo out. Reed, still standing near the exit, turned to see her. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Then pain. It was her son, the prisoner from the letter. She didn't shout, didn't accuse. She simply looked at him and whispered one sentence, loud enough for no microphone but strong enough for every soul in the room. "He waited for you to understand." Reed didn't reply. He just nodded once.
Twice.
Like each nod was a year he'd taken to get here. And then came the shift. A young law student in the gallery, barely 20, idealistic, hopeful, still believing in the promise of the law, stood up and began to clap.
Softly.
Hesitantly. Not in praise, but in acknowledgement. In mourning. In rebirth. Then another. And another. But this wasn't a standing ovation. It was a rising. People rose not to celebrate, but to carry the weight together. Like mourners who had seen a burial and knew they would now have to rebuild from the dust. Lila Morgan did not stand. She closed her folder, turned off her microphone, and walked toward the exit, passing Reed without a word. But as she passed, she paused briefly, placed her hand on the table he had once ruled from, and then let it go. That gesture was enough. It was not forgiveness. It was not closure. It was history shifting its weight onto different shoulders. Outside, the sky had changed too. Not in color, not in weather, but in stillness. The protesters who had gathered with signs and chants now stood in quiet clusters, watching the courthouse door, not sure what to do next. For the first time, they weren't yelling. They were waiting, listening. When Franklin Reed finally exited, there were no cameras in his face. Just eyes.
Hundreds of them.
Some wet, some skeptical, all open.
He didn't speak.
Didn't raise a hand. He simply walked down the steps alone. But not invisible. And not, for the first time in his life, untouchable. As he reached the sidewalk, a child broke free from her mother's grip and ran up to him. No fear. Just innocent confusion. She asked, "Are you the man from the news?" Reed looked down, nodded gently. "I used to be," he answered. She blinked. "Are you bad?" He crouched slowly, his knees stiff, and met her eyes.
"I was wrong," he said.
"But I'm trying to be better." The mother called her back, and the girl ran off, satisfied. Reed stood there, watching her disappear into the city crowd. And, in that final moment, the shift became clear. The system hadn't collapsed, but it had listened. For once. And maybe, just maybe, it had learned how to hear.